Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's Jessa. Welcome back to my newest episode of the Better Sex Podcast. So glad you're here. I have so much fun doing the show. I'd probably do this if nobody was listening, just because I enjoy these conversations so much. But I am glad you're here, and I hope it's useful. You know, I'm always looking for new topics. There's such a huge range of things to talk about regarding sex, and that's always really interesting. And this guest today, I had on my show already once before. I've only done a couple of repeats so far, but I had to have her back because this is what we were supposed to talk about the first time. So Amy Lang runs the website Birds and Bees and Kids. And she's written a book, and she's done all these trainings, and it's got all these resources, and she has a podcast. She's this incredible wealth of information. And we are finally, this time, going to talk about talking to your kids about sex. That was the topic the first time, but we got totally off on this incredibly important tangent of recognizing signs of sexual abuse in children. And I don't even know how we ended up there. When I look back, I don't know. But that's what took up the episode. So I really had to have her back to just talk about talking to your kids about sex. And I actually did another episode with somebody else on the same topic because I think it's that important. So anyway, Amy Lang is my guest again. Thrilled she's here, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. The Better Sex Podcast is brought to you by the Sex Without Stress online course. It's a course for couples to escape the cycle of disappointment, avoidance, and pressure in your sex life. So if you're in a pretty good relationship, there's a lot of love and goodwill, but sex is your struggle, this could be for you. You work in the privacy of your own home and at your own pace to create a sex life you can both look forward to. If you want to learn more, go to sexwithoutstress.com/program. Amy, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
My total pleasure.
And as I will say in the introduction, this was going to be the topic originally, and then we got off on a whole different important tangent. So I'm glad we're coming back to this now.
Yeah, circling back to where we should have started with that, frankly. I think because we needed to go there for a variety of reasons, and now we can do the fun stuff.
Right, exactly. So talk to me about how, the importance of talking to kids about sex. Like, how do you view this? Obviously, this has been your life's work, right? So tell me a little bit about why you are so focused on this.
Well, part of the reason I'm so focused on this is because I worked in sexual health for a long time. I started out as a volunteer. And then when I had the idea for Birds and Bees and Kids, I was working at Planned Parenthood. And I just had this realization that these young people that I was seeing were pretty clueless about how everything worked. Like, they knew they needed birth control, and that was good, but they didn't know they had a vulva, right? Like, they didn't know the language, and they weren't very comfortable talking about their healthcare needs. And so that's when I was that was one of the things that made me go, oh, they need help.
Okay.
And the best people to help them, of course, is their parents or whoever their primary caregiver is.
Yeah.
And I also had a 4 or 5-year-old at the time. And I was like, uh-oh, you gotta get your shit together, sister, because you need to do this for your own child. And I was woefully unprepared. And so those two things, having my own kid and then seeing how these young adults and even older adults were so clueless. And I thought, I can change this. and I have a master's degree in adult education, and I was a sexuality educator for a super long time. So I just combined those two things that I love, both of those things, and here we are.
So when you say you're woefully unprepared, for what? Because it sounds like you had the education background, you had the sex background. Like, what was it? Just talking to your own kid about this? It felt like you weren't quite ready, or?
Well, I was just talking to a kid at all. Like I had this revelation when Milo was about 4 or 5. And so on the one hand, I was really prepared. On the other hand, as a parent, I knew I was going to have to talk to him, and my husband and I were going to need to talk to him. And there was just this moment when I realized that I just I had to talk to my kid about like what's circumcision, and I had to talk about, like penises going in vaginas, and it kind of freaked me out. And then I was like, great, I'd rather talk to a pregnant 14-year-old girl than my 4-year-old boy. And that was like the moment where I was like, oh no, this is not okay, right?
Wow.
I mean, yay me, 14-year-old girl, pregnant 14-year-old girl, that's great and important, but not as important as me being my kid's first and primary and most important sexuality educator. So that's kind of how I got okay, you got to figure this out.
Well, it also sort of highlights, what the struggle is. So even somebody who's armed with the information, who's armed as an educator, can maybe struggle to talk to their own kids. And so you think about all the people that don't have that background. It's like, no wonder this is so tricky. Right?
Yeah. So there's just some weird barrier between a parent and a child around sexuality. Part of it, I think, might be a little bit natural, but most of it, I think, is fear-based. And, a lot of what happens for us is, as parents, is we look at our kids and we're like, you got to know about sex. And then everything we know about sex is in our head, right? Like the good stuff, the bad stuff, our own personal stories, the awesome stuff, the weird stuff,
right.
And all the things we see and hear in the media, or, our friends are doing this and all that, right? So we've got all that in our heads, and we look at our kid and we think, hell no, no way. I'm not talking to you. This is too much information. And then that's all confused with, well, what is the right amount of information? And then trying to figure that out. And in our culture in the US, we have, pretty crappy examples of what that should look like.
Yeah.
And then, so it's this whole social, cultural, personal, like a ball of wax, or I even think about it more like pull the blanket over your head, right? I'm just going under. And so for me, I saw that. And then, as I've been doing this work for the past, 12, 13 years, I still see that it's gotten better in some ways. The younger the parents are, the more open they are. But it's still there. So our job, I think, as parents is to acknowledge that there's this barrier. It's there for a reason.
Yeah.
And then to all right, shove that crap in the dark place. Down to this, my husband always says, shove it into the dark place and get on with it. I mean, and that's my very nice way of saying get over yourself and get on with this, because this is not our children's fault. This has nothing to do with our kids. It's all about us.
And what's the cost if we don't do this? If kids are not armed with good information, what's the impact? I mean, I can imagine you may end up with a 14-year-old girl who's pregnant, right? We've got that, but what are the other ramifications of, talking to our kids about sex?
Well, not to sound like a cliche, but just take a look at your own life. Take a look at your own sexual decision making. Take a look at your own early relationships. Take a look at your current relationship, right? That's going to tell you a lot about what happens when kids don't have, and it's just not penis and vagina, right? It's full on sexuality, sexual health, relational health. If we look at this in the bigger, broader picture, we all know how it goes sideways. So let me just give you some examples, right? That's, like I said, that was it's, look at yourself, so what we see is obviously unplanned pregnancy, sex that kids are not ready for, bad relationships, they don't understand what's happening in that, early relationship when sex is on the table, and dating and romance, and trying to figure out who likes who and what's too far and what's too much and what's consent and what's not consent, and how do we balance all of that? And if we think about it from perspective of I know you talk about this, which is this is a lifelong health issue. It's a social, psychological health issue. And so there's a lot of stuff that can go sideways without good sexual health education. And most of it, a whole lot of it is relational. And like how relationships develop, what they look like, what's healthy, what's not healthy. And if your kids don't have a space or a place where they're hearing, like, hey, like just talking about consent, right? Everyone's talking about consent. So helping kids understand that, it's not no means no, it's yes means yes. You want a wholehearted yes for everyone. And the minute it's not a yes, then it's, you stop. And, for everybody, like if you're just getting a vibe that the person you're with isn't into it, then that's enough, right? That's enough. And if you're grown, you say, I'm getting the vibe you're not into this. And they say, sure I am. And you could say, I'm not now, right?
Right.
I don't trust this. And, in the age of Me Too, everyone's a little freaked out, mostly men and boys, which not to be total snot about this, but sorry. We've been putting up with this shit for so long that if they're uncomfortable, oh, well, good luck. You'll get over it or you won't, or just manage it. And so I think what we all want for our kids, like I want for my son, is I want him to have a lot of information so he feels good about his decision making. He has respectful relationships, that he's safe in relationships, that he sees when things are funky. He's in his first relationship right now. And, fingers crossed that he's managing all aspects of that well and healthily. Of course, as every sex educator will tell you, he won't talk to me about anything. It's great. It's great. So anyway, I think we all know how can go sideways. Yeah. Because almost all of us had this same kind of crappy, get it at school, in the 5th grade, then a revisit in 9th, and then maybe a little something else in 11th. And that's what we get. And if you think about now, kids get the internet, they get pornography, they get lots of sexualized messages and music, their friends talk to each other. And so they're getting this very adult-like sexuality information, and they don't have a context for it.
Yeah, it's really without context. Yeah. So you said, there's some sex ed in schools, maybe. And I think parents can have this idea of, doesn't the school take care of this? Aren't they learning this in health class and I can just leave it alone and know that they're covered?
Yeah, that's a thing. And there's no way in hell that a school can do what needs to be done. Yeah. And it's not soon enough. It's not enough. It's not detailed enough. It's not values based. Sometimes it is, but those values usually aren't the family's values. Right. And it's also not consistent, right? I am all for school sex ed, even the crappy school sex ed that we know doesn't work, because our kids need to know what everybody's learning. And then we can talk to them about, why abstinence only doesn't work, because everybody does it by the time they're, the stat is like 19, 20, something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember the statistic.
It's like 80 or 90% of people have done it, right? Yeah. So telling them not to do it has never worked. Right. It is never going to work. It does not work. But telling them to wait and why it's important to wait and how to be prepared if they decide to have sex, and that it should be a decision that's made between the two partners, that's something else.
Yeah. Well, and it's missing, this is my own little soapbox, but of course, sex ed is missing anything about pleasure, and intimacy and connection and eroticism and empowerment and self-knowledge, all those parts are just, absent. It's about don't get pregnant, don't get sick.
Right. And so for parents, we can change that and say, okay, sex should feel good. Like the main reason people have sex is because it feels good. A very small percentage of the time are people trying to make a baby. Everybody's doing it because it feels good. And there's connection and intimacy. And not always. Sometimes it's just banging it out because it feels good, right? So understanding those nuances, schools can't. They're getting better. Like private schools can really dig deeper into that. But most public schools cannot for a variety of stupid reasons. Frankly, mostly people are chicken. They don't want to offend someone because talking about pleasure is going to make kids have sex. See my earlier statement. They're going to do it anyway. So I totally agree with you. We have to talk pleasure. We have to talk about intimacy. We have to talk about those pieces of it because that's what makes good sex, right?
Right. I'm thinking from the listener's point of view. Do they just answer whatever questions they get? Do you ever recommend people hold back at all? If a kid is old enough to ask the question, do they just answer it?
Sometimes you just can answer. Sometimes you might need to say, let me think about that and I'll get back to you. Because you might need to oh my God, my kid just asked me what an abortion is and they're 7, right? So that's going to take a little nuance, right? That's not something you're going to just jump right into. And the other place too is if kids ask you personal questions. How old were you when you had sex for the first time? I think that is a legit question to answer, but a couple of caveats. I would make that the first time you chose to have sex.
Yes.
Right? Because our kids do not need to know about our traumas.
Right.
Right? It's just traumatizing to them.
Yeah.
They need to see us as whole and healthy. So if you you can say, yeah, I was 18, or whatever your story is, and maybe you chose to have sex, but you realized later that you were like, ugh, I wasn't in a relationship with that person. I did it to get it out of the way. That's me. My friends pressured me. I just got it out of the way. And it was pretty good. I would probably do it again, except for the being super drunk part. But I retrospect, right? So I would probably do it again, but there are pieces of it that I didn't want. And my husband had a much better experience. He was in love. Her mom knew. They had birth control. They were in a safe place. And, that's what I want for my son. So when we talked about that, that's what I focused on. So it's okay to answer those questions. But the thing is that you need to be ready with an answer. And part of that is doing your own work and also knowing, what's age appropriate and how do you answer kids' questions. But I guess my takeaway is, yes, you need to answer the question. If it's something really hard, like a 7-year-old says, what's rape? You got to think about that. You can't just jump in and say, oh, thanks for asking. That's when one person forces another person to have sex. It's bad, right?
Yeah.
That's hard to hear, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I'm a huge advocate of early sexuality education, starting in kindergarten, because then if a 7 or 8-year-old says, what's rape? They already have the context of health and pleasure and consent and agreement. And then you can say, hey, okay, remember we talked about sex and that people do that because it feels good to their grown-up bodies. It's something they agree to do. It's a really wonderful part of life. And sometimes one person will force another person to have sex or do something sexual with them, and that's called rape. It's a scary thing. It's uncomfortable. It can be really sad. And thank you for asking me. You need to know about this. It's a hard part of life. It's a scary part of life. But most of the time, people like to have sex with each other. They agree to have sex with each other. Everybody says yes to doing something sexual.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any questions? And
so it seems to me that this is also important in the era of pervasive pornography, right? That younger and younger kids are accessing this material on, by accident or not, and they're going to, if they don't have the context to ask the questions or to understand, not that they're really going to understand what they're seeing, but, if they bring something up because they got exposed to it, if you've never talked about sex before, it's going to be a more challenging conversation than if you've laid that foundation.
Yeah, it's really, it's so important to lay that foundation of health. And I'm just going to say normalcy, because even though all that stuff can be normal. But when we see pornography, it's acting, it's not real sex. It starts in the middle. So if your kids know that sex is a process and that the parts and holes and mouths on parts part is usually sort of the middle part of things, it's not like you don't automatically start there, which is what porn looks like.
Yeah.
And of course, you wouldn't say this to your, porn exposed 6-year-old, right? You would talk about it a little bit differently, but to your 12-year-old or 10-year-old even, you want to say that directly, but that means your kid needs to have the healthy intel, like they need to know what sexuality is. And I think the thing I haven't said is that the only person that can talk to your kids about your values is you.
Yeah.
And so if you're not talking about sexuality and your values, then your child really doesn't have any place to start from. Right. So they're going to get what they get and they're going to do what they do. And most of us don't want our kids, having unprotected sex. We want them to be in a relationship, that we want them to be partnered, especially for their first time. Right. Like in a perfect world, everyone would have what my husband had. Right. In love. Right. She's on birth control or whatever, like committed, consenting, parents know, safe. And that's the launch. Right. As opposed to drunk with a 23-year-old guy when I was barely 18. He was lovely. It was all planned, but again.
Yeah. But not optimum, right? Like might want to do that differently.
Yeah.
All right. So what kinds of conversations do we have at the various ages? I mean, every kid's different, I suppose, but are there some guidelines for what you're talking about in kindergarten versus 5th grade versus 9th grade? And, do you have some resources for how, age appropriate conversation?
Yeah, totally. So the thing we have to remember is that the sex talks start from birth, and it's by using the correct names for private body parts, explaining, I'm going to wipe your vulva, like talking about that, using the words, with younger siblings seeing their new babies. It's an opposite sex kid. It's like, what is that thing hanging off the front of him? That's his penis.
Right.
Those are his testicles. Like starting out using correct names for private body parts. And then that leads naturally into more conversations. And my belief is that they should know how babies are made by the time they're in kindergarten. And some people are like, dear God, right? And a lot of people are like, that makes sense. And so for the dear God people, just a couple reasons why.
Yeah.
5-year-olds are super curious. They're super open to information. When you tell a kid the usual way a baby's made is the penis goes in the vagina, they're like, huh. And they take that in the same way as if you said, this is how you milk a cow. This is how a car works. It's all the same value to them. They're in school with kids that have all kinds of different things going on in their families. Lots of kids have seen pornography or adult-like movies. They have older siblings, so they're using slang. They're talking about this. There's also, just establishing that you're the one, you've got all the goods, you know everything, you're the resource.
Yeah.
Really important to do that sooner rather than later. And then the last thing, and this was the thing when I was figuring all this out, because I was like, 5? No, thank you. Which, understandably. The last thing is that kids who have open communication with their parents about sexuality, who can talk to them, whose parents are educating them, those kids are safer from sexual abuse.
Yeah.
And so that for me was like, I'm in. I am all in.
Okay.
And if that's not motivating, I don't know what is. I mean, there's a ton of research out there that shows this.
Wow.
And, I think this is how we got on this
topic.
That
probably is how we got on that.
So we're going to step back. Yeah. So getting the baby making and the body parts out of the way by the time, and the different kinds of families and consent and safe touch, all that should be out of the way by the time they're 5. And then you have to keep talking about it, right? And keep on the topic because it comes up all the time. So like an aunt is pregnant. All right, perfect opportunity to talk with your 8-year-old about any number of things, right? Yeah. How our body's going to change and how she got pregnant. If your aunt is married to a woman, then where's the penis, right? Right. So different ways of becoming pregnant. And you just want to keep adding on and adding on. So with a 5-year-old, you're going to be really simple. With an 8 or 9-year-old, you're going to give more detail. Everybody needs to know about puberty at about 8 or 9.
Yeah.
Because girls start their periods as young as 9. And puberty does not start with bleeding. It starts with breast buds. Right. That's how you know if you've got puberty at your house, if you've got a gal. And if you have a boy, then they get stinky. That's what you're going to notice. Really, their testicles get bigger, but you're not going to see that theoretically. And really, no one wants to see that. Yeah. So they start to smell like goats and farts. That's the real indication that puberty is there. As you may recall, it's not the best of times.
Yeah.
Smelly. And then by the time they start middle school, they should know the basics of everything. So I mean the good stuff, the bad stuff. They should know what oral and anal sex is. They need to know all about birth control. They need to understand what consent is and have a sense of what a healthy relationship looks like. They need to know about STIs. They need to know slang. They need to know, funny stuff. They need to know, they need to have this wealth of information so that when they're hearing stuff from their peers, you want your kid to be the smartest kid on the school bus, the smartest kid on the playground. So they hear somebody say oral sex is when you, kiss with tongues or something, right? And you want your kid to be the one to say, not so much. And ideally not correct.
Right.
But they correct. Hey
everybody, it's Jessa, and we're just taking a little break in the show so I can share something exciting with you. At least I think it's exciting. You know, I wrote a book called Sex Without Stress, and I had turned it into an online course. And now I've reformatted it so that you can sign up at any time. It's more like an a la carte thing. For less than $100, you and your partner can work through this entire process, guided through webinars and assignments and conversations to have and real-world exercises to use to take the stress out of your sex life. So if you're in a good relationship and sex is the issue, this could be a perfect fit. And then separate from that, you can opt into my membership group, month at a time, or you can sign up for a whole year. That's where you'll get the personal support while you're working through the process. So it comes with Q&A sessions, bonus content, some guest presenters, and a private support community, like a forum. So that's priced separately so you can just participate in that when it's useful to you. Anyway, if you want to learn more, go to sexwithoutstress.com. And now back to the show. So some of these conversations, they're not going to ask you. I mean, you know, this idea of let me just tell you what anal sex is, I mean, where do you suggest people introduce these conversations? You know, you get them trapped in the car where you're driving to soccer and they can't get out. Is that, you know?
Yeah, that's one tactic. I mean, I recommend the car tactic, but don't. I had one mom say to me, Amy, I think I've overused the car thing. She said, my kids were getting in the car and they were like, no sex talks, please don't talk to us about sex. I'm like, yeah, you're done. Like, you've ruined that.
Right.
So in the car is fine. Use it judiciously. You know, one thing I recommend is saying to your kid, like, hey, I got to talk to you about a sex thing. You want to do it now or you want to do it later?
Okay.
I almost always say later, especially if they're in middle school. Yeah. And then you pick the later, and it should be within 48 hours. And you just say, okay, it's later. And they've been prepared. And then you just say what you need to say. They may have questions, they may not. But one of the things with adolescents is you can watch their mood and see when they're most receptive. So if your kid's chatty, be careful because they don't want to be constantly barraged with like sex stuff. But if you know that your kid after 9 o'clock is super chatty and open to talking, then that would be a time.
Yeah.
Another time is when you're doing something else. And boys do not like straight on eye-to-eye contact. They do not do well with that. Girls are better about it, but pretty much everybody prefers a side-to-side conversation.
Right.
So your older kids are kind of like, oh, here she goes. But your littler kids, they're not going to notice if you're like, oh, hey, I was thinking, or I read this thing in the paper, or I heard this song lyric. Do you know what, I don't know, I can't think of it. I'm like full of the worst like sex terms, but you know what this means? Or, somebody just had a baby and it's a boy and I realized we'd never talked about circumcision. Like, you can make up places, and frankly, they're dumb. They don't know. Like, you're like, I was just thinking, and you've been researching how to talk about something, right? I was just thinking, we haven't talked about artificial insemination in weeks, right? So like, they don't know. But as your kids get older, they're going to get savvy to you. And ideally, by the time they are in like 7th grade, all bets are off. Like, don't screen, don't not talk about things, because everyone's porn exposed at some point. Their peers are using porn regularly. They're talking about it. And so you need to be ahead of the game and talking about all that stuff. And again, like this focus on what's a healthy relationship. How do you know when you're in love? How do you know who you are as a sexual person, right? Who are you attracted to? Who do you have a crush on? Like, talking about that stuff helps them. Right. It helps them.
And by what age, I mean, because this is reminding me too of what I did with my own kids. I mean, starting to talk about sexual orientation and gender identity as to put that on the table and to set that stage so that no matter how any of them turned out, they would feel already welcome. Like, they'd have that knowledge. That wouldn't be some surprise if, somebody's gay down the road and it's a big deal. Like, when do you introduce those concepts, do you think?
Well, what we did with Milo the whole time he was growing up is we'd say, when you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, when we said that. And finally he's like, I'm not gay. So you can quit saying that. So using language like that, like not assuming, being really careful about how you talk about gay or trans folks or non-binary folks or people who are, gender fluid or trans or whatever, like being careful about the language you use, because you cannot tell really, I mean, sometimes you can, but you cannot tell by looking, right? You cannot tell by looking. And so if you're judgmental and mean and use, kind of derogatory language or scoff or make jokes about, then your child's paying attention to you. And what you're transmitting is, I can't tolerate this, and I sure as hell am not going to be able to tolerate it in you.
Right.
And so underground. And I just saw a study, which of course I cannot find now, that shows that, maybe it was on pflag.org, that shows that parental support is the number one thing when it comes to suicide prevention, frankly,
right.
And in LGBTQ plus kids. So, and it is 100% that is the most preventative. It drops down when they're 95. The suicide rates increase as the support drops down.
Right.
And, our job as parents is to support our children no matter what. And we're adults. We get help.
Yeah.
And if our child needs help, we get our child help. But we have to get our poop in a group and manage our own crap away from our child. Yeah. Because I am pretty sure no one wants their child to kill themselves.
Right.
Just guessing.
Yeah.
Just guessing.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's going on right now, which I'm finding really interesting, and I'm getting emails and calls from around the country, and lots of girls in 6th, 7th grade are deciding and telling their families that they're bisexual or they're asexual. And this is freaking some parents out.
Right.
And yeah, they might be, they might not be. The number of them is a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, just know statistically, probably 15% of the population, or 10, is something other than straight. And so this is important. I think what girls are doing is they have the opportunity to explore what that means, having very close relationships with girlfriends, and sexual play and sexual behavior can happen between girlfriends just as a typical developmental stage of experimentation. They may decide that means that they're gay or they're bi because they have had sexual feelings and have done this, and our culture is way more open. So I just had a mom actually email me from New Mexico, and her stepdaughter came out to her and said, I'm bi, I'm dating my best friend. And she said, we're not that close. But she said, I think the reason she told me is because my 3-year-old said to her grandmother, when I grow up, I'm going to marry a girl. And her grandmother said, no, you can't. And the stepmom, said, actually, honey, yes, you can. Wow. And so the 12-year-old stepdaughter overheard that. And so she knew she could trust her.
Yeah.
And so there's a little struggle around super conservative, I'm assuming Christian family, grandmother and mother. What do we do with that? And the stepmom and her dad are in. They're like, we're going to support you no matter what. And they're doing the right thing.
And those comments, right, create so much permission and trust and safety for our kids that we demonstrate through word and deed over time that we're going to accept them.
Yeah. And that we're safe, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this stepmom is like, what have I done? And I was just like, lucky you, lucky her, right? Count your blessings.
Yeah.
And I guess my advice to parents is just wait.
Yeah.
Be kind, be calm, accept it for what it is. Just wait.
Yeah.
And maybe they're bi, maybe they're not, maybe they're gay, maybe they're back and forth. Your job is to just be there for your child and deal with your own discomfort elsewhere. And sometimes this is a tall order for families, right? What do you do if you're a family who is culturally opposed or doesn't believe in, and your child says this? You need to figure out how you're going to manage those things.
Right.
And those two worlds, what's the most important thing, your faith or your child? I'm an atheist, so I'm easy, right? I got it easy, right? I got it easy. But the good news is right now there's so much help and support for families and for kids. And so I think that this is a good thing, and especially for girls and women to be able to say I'm a sexual being. I like this. I don't like this. I'm going to have time and space to figure it out. And which is all good news. And, it's all learning how to be in relationship.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah. So what do parents do to get more comfortable talking about sex, to deal with their discomfort about any of these topics that come up? If they've got value judgments or training that tells them something isn't okay, or like what are the resources or the tools for people to get over themselves, do that work,
Yeah.
show up for their kids.
Yeah. So my first book is called Birds and Bees and Your Kids. And that's the whole goal, is to help parents figure out what are your values about this? How do you want to talk about it? And it really helps us if we get our values are our roots, right? So if you're clear about your values and you know what you believe and you know how you're going to talk about it, when it comes up, you're going to be way more solid than if you're like, I don't know what I quite believe about what do I believe about IUDs? I believe, right? So if you have your roots in place, then you're going to feel better. You're going to do better. And honestly, practice. Practice. Like if you say, hey, this is what oral sex is and no one dies, right? Or you have a clitoris, girlfriend.
Right.
You should become really good friends with it, right? So as you practice, you're going to feel better and do better. And so I think the main thing is like using my book, or I also have an online solution center where there's tons of resources there. And just like your kids need education, you need education. Like we need education.
Yeah.
And there's no shame. Nobody, parents, and nobody knows what they're doing when they're parenting, let alone parenting around the most taboo topic in the history of taboo topics, right?
Right.
So, there's no shame, and everyone's in the same boat. I mean, even people who had lots of sexual health education, who like super informed, like I've had people talk to me who are from the Netherlands and they're like, yeah, I kind of got this. But in the Netherlands, they have sex education from kindergarten all the way through. So there's no not knowing, right? So like out of that culture into our culture where it's like, what? It's not happening at school? Crap, right? So, I think like one of my recommendations is that we all be like the Netherlands in our families. Open, consistent, evidence, fact-based. And then the piece that doesn't really happen in the Netherlands is about values. Values.
Yeah. And I guess like if people, I mean, maybe they already have teenagers by the time they're listening to this podcast, but if you start early and get over some of that anxiety and you build up your skill set, right, by the time they're 7 or 8 or 9, you're much more comfortable too.
Yeah.
But I guess if somebody's just listening now and they have teenagers, it's never too late to start that open conversation either, right?
Although they're going to be like, oh my God, I already know it all.
Yeah.
And that's where you get to say, A, no flipping way. And B, you know what? I need to talk to you about some things. So I want you to make good decisions. And I want you to feel like you can come to me if you're uncomfortable. I want you to know that. And I am a big fan of apologizing to our children when we've made a mistake. So if you have not started talking to your kids and they are, I don't know, 5th grade, you need to say, I am really sorry. I should have started talking to you about this sooner. I didn't know you were ready. I wasn't ready. Here we go.
Yeah.
And with your teenagers, same thing. I blew it. We should have been talking about this. I'm worried. I want you to make good decisions. I know I made crappy decisions. So we need to start talking about this. And the teenager is going to be like, okay, crazy town. Or they'll say, I don't want to talk about this with you. And then you have to like think about like, what's the most important thing to you? And usually with older kids, it's around values.
Yeah.
It's around values, like, and making sure they have resources and, really talking about consent and what healthy relationships look like and that kind of thing.
Right.
And, kids get manipulated, right? Like my big worry for Milo right now, his girlfriend is sweet and darling. And I am worried that she is going to pull one of those, I can't live without you things. I don't think so. I don't know her very well. Right. But I had like, I'm the kind of mom that's like, oh crap, he's a heroin addict. Like I go all the way.
Catastrophizing is what
I am a good catastrophizer. Yes, I am great at that. And he cracked up. I said to him, how can you be so like chill and easy? I said, I'm just terrified that you're a heroin addict and you're having sex with men for money. And he's like, oh my God. So now of course he's like, bye, going to get some smack. So, I know. So anyway, I'm a mom too, right?
You say a word about your website and the services that you have that people might avail themselves of.
Yes, I'm happy to. So my website is birdsandbeesandkids.com, and there is a ton of helpful information there. I have a very robust blog. I have a newsletter that I send out once a month with a digest. I have a solution center, which basically has every single thing you could ever possibly need for talking to your kids. So there's stuff to get you settled and rocking and rolling. There's age by age information. There's webinars on pornography, on talking to girls, talking to boys, puberty, all kinds of things. And I don't work with kids. I only work with adults.
Okay.
So that's all available.
So you can't handle this for them, right? You're not going to call
Oh, no. I mean, $15,000 cash, I will do it.
Okay.
I will do it. And no one's taken me up on that yet.
I was going to say, I bet you there may be one or two people willing to pass that off.
Occasionally, but then they're going to get my values, and so that might not work out for them.
Right.
But, my values are perfect. So there's that. And then the other thing is that I have a podcast too. It's called Just Say This, and it's all Q&A style. So people call in, leave me a voicemail message, and then I answer on the show.
Perfect.
And that's really fun because it's potluck, because it could be a question about a 2-year-old, a question about a 19-year-old. So it's really fun. And I'm really loving doing that, as I'm guessing you probably do too. So my website, Birds and Bees and Kids, is the easiest way to connect with me. But, I'm super available. So if you're there and you have a question, don't feel shy about reaching out.
Great. Thank you so much. I so appreciate your time and your expertise. And I'm sure this will be a very useful episode for people.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I love talking about sex.
Me too.
I know.
Okay.
Yay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.